So Margo DeMello, cultural anthropologist here, fairly new interest in cryptids. So I'm new to the whole thing. Started the project I'm working on now right at the beginning of COVID. It was going to be an ethnographic project, and then that whole thing kind of went into the crapper. And so anyway, here we are. Let's hear from the rest of you. Samantha? Nope.
I assume I'm next, so I'll be next.
Okay.
Yeah, no, my name's Gregory Forth. Yeah, 3 syllables, so you're perfectly welcome to call me Greg. What's to say, I'm a retired anthropologist in more ways than one. I've been Professor Emeritus at the University of Alberta since 2019, just before the pandemic, which was perfect timing. I started life as academic life as a fairly straightforward, I guess, social or cultural anthropologist. But 10 years after taking up a position in Alberta, I became quite focused on ethnozoology or folk zoology, as it's sometimes called, that overlaps with various sorts of studies of human-animal relations, and I guess anthrozoology as well, although somebody might want to contradict that. What can I say? I've published a fair amount in the field of ethnozoology, including, I would say, several articles to do with local reports of creatures which are in particular places where academic zoologists say they aren't, or at least don't recognize their being present in those places. So maybe that's enough for now, and I'll turn it over to somebody else.
Samantha, I'm just going to call on you.
Okay, great. Hi, lovely to meet so many of you, and Greg and I have corresponded over many years, and it's really lovely to see him for the first time.
Oh,
yeah, and you, Margo, as well. So like Greg, I'm an anthropologist by training. I did a very kind of, I guess, conventional anthropological PhD in some respects, but focusing on a rural farming community in Wales. And during the process of doing doctoral research, I was originally concerned with kind of more mundane human-animal interactions in farming contexts, but increasingly heard kind of accounts or people's experiences of big cats, non-endemic big cats in the locality. And so that kind of piqued my interest and became a bit of a tangential project to my doctoral research. And it wasn't until I had what I would describe as a kind of a conversion experience or an encounter with what seemed to be a non-endemic big cat, and then started collaborating with forensic archaeologists at the University of Wales, where I was based at the time, who were doing forensic analyses on carcasses of sheep that farmers were claiming had been predated upon by non-endemic big cats. And the data that came back from some of those analyses, those kind of investigations, was that they were indeed predated on or had been interacted with in some way by medium-sized felids. So not lions and tigers, but kind of puma, jaguar, leopardy kind of sized felids. So yeah, that's kind of where my interest in cryptids came from. And off the back of that, I hosted a panel at one of the ASA, Association of Social Anthropologists, conferences quite a few years ago now. And from that, we put together quite a varied edited volume on different kind of multidisciplinary but predominantly anthropological encounters with different cryptids in different cultural contexts. So yeah, that's where my interest in it and expertise lies. So thanks very much for inviting me.
Sure. Richard.
Thanks, Margo. So I'm Richard Fallon. I'm a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at the University of Birmingham. My background is literature and English, which is slightly different, of course, to anthropology, as if that needs stating. But my specialism is really the 19th century and the early 20th century, particularly British and American literature. My PhD was on dinosaurs, which I published recently in a version as a book. And I guess my into cryptozoology really, or the prehistory of it, is the preeminence of paleontological creatures in cryptozoology, and also in the literature, the fictional literature that emerged in the late 19th century of kind of lost world fiction. So there's the fictional aspect to it, but also, I mean, I'm very interested in the cultural history of it in this period, relating to things like the kind of cryptids we could say that emerged in this period. For example, you got the kind of African starving sauropods, things like that. And also, I got quite interested in the case of Arthur Conan Doyle's claim to have seen an Ichthyosaurus in the Aegean in 1907. Still waiting. Darren, if you ever find any more sources on that, I'd be very happy to find out, because I'm always chasing sources on this this particular issue.
Right.
That's my connection. Is a kind of the prehistory of cryptozoology in the kind of late 19th, early 20th century in particular, particularly in fiction, but also in wider culture.
Yeah. And Darren.
Yeah, thank you for that introduction, and very pleased to be here today. My name's Darren Naish. I'm qualified in vertebrate paleontology, and I mostly work on dinosaurs of the Cretaceous and on other Mesozoic marine reptiles, but I write widely and publish widely on other aspects of zoology, anything to do with the evolutionary history and diversity of animals. Really, I blog at Tetrapod Zoology, where I cover quite a wide range of animals, and alongside my interest in the normal animals, if you like, whether they be living or extinct, I have a long-standing interest in cryptozoology. I've been publishing continuously on the subject since the early 1990s, initially on sea monsters and mystery whales, and I've also I've published academically on British big cats. I've been involved in discussions on Australian mystery marsupials and crypto hominids, anomalous primates, whatever you want to call them. And yeah, I'm really excited in what happens today. So yeah, thank you for the introduction.
Let's start with this question of colonialism, and I don't want to put thoughts into anyone's heads, but clearly cryptozoology intersects with everything from colonial attitudes to colonial processes to independence movements. Cryptozoology kind of is implicated in all of those areas. And I thought we might sort of speak to what about that? Is it a problem? Should we think that it's a problem? I mean, Richard in particular with those African sauropods, or frankly, so many different, for me, it's the American Bigfoot and the ways in which local indigenous knowledge has been brought into, taken out of its cultural context and brought into a cryptozoological narrative in a way that I think is kind of troubling. So I was hoping to sort of start with something like that. What do you, how do you all sort of feel about those issues?
Can I make an initial brief and fairly superficial comment, really, and probably low-hanging fruit, the easiest thing to say, which is that for me, a big chunk of the mainstream superstar cryptids, a big chunk of them fall into this prehistoric survivor category. This idea that there's this whole cast of characters that we're familiar with due to their appearance in, fairly popular books on prehistoric life, and it's implied or stated in the cryptozoological literature that darkest Africa might be home to sauropods and living pterosaurs and even surviving saber-toothed cats and assorted obscure fossil mammals. And these creatures are generally associated with a very crude term here, so massive air quotes, the dark parts of the world, the unexplored places. And I think it's becoming increasingly well-known, increasingly discussed within academic cryptozoology that a lot of these ideas which developed, they only became popular, they only became a thing in the late 1800s and early 1900s, Richard's sort of key area of interest, if you like. It was because Europeans and European people in North America were saying that places like Amazonia and the Congolese region were these dark, unexplored hearts where time hadn't moved on, that there was still not just vast unexplored tracts of swampland, but they were inhabited by these creatures from ancient times, and that the people were also, you know, people of ancient times. They were Paleolithic people. That people did, you know, writers did actually say that. They said specifically they're people of Paleolithic style still living in places like tropical Africa. Of course, it's a crass, unfair generalization about the complexity and diversity of peoples in those parts, and definitely fueled by colonialism. And I think that's where the idea comes from, is that there isn't an existing tradition of sauropod-like animals in tropical Africa. It only arises when Europeans become aware of these animals in the fossil record and then cast them as main characters in promoting that view of the tropics, of the global south in particular.
Well, that sounds to me, if I can take it up from there, like something of an overgeneralization. I mean, that could be the source of certain cryptids or ideas about cryptid creatures. On the other hand, in my own work, what I've mostly been familiar with are members of small-scale non-European societies who claim, you know, in a very ordinary kind of a way, without making any particular sort of argument, they claim that there are creatures that exist in the local environment. Some people might say they've seen them, but on the other hand, academic zoologists, not exclusively Western, of course, but professionals in scientific zoology claim that no, these are purely imaginary, they're purely mythical, they couldn't possibly exist. Usually, you know, that's where the reaction ends. But I'm wondering, in that situation, which is the one I know best, you know, who are the colonials, who are the colonizers? It seems to me a lot of dispute, a lot of argument about whether things exist or could possibly exist or not comes down to a question of authority. And implicitly, at any rate, the academic zoologists, paleontologists as well, I suppose, reckon that, you know, they're the ones in the know, only their methods, their epistemology, ontology, and all the rest of it,
Right.
it really counts. So, you know, nobody else has a right to proclaim about the existence of certain kinds of things that are represented as animals, that are described in fairly naturalistic sorts of ways, so that, you know, they might at least be grounded in you know, some natural species. So usually, of course, the academic scientists dismiss reports of other things as anecdote. This is a favorite term in the conversation. On the other hand, it has been proclaimed by somebody or other whose name I can't recall at the moment that the plural of anecdote is evidence. I'm sure not everybody would agree with that, but yeah, I think you and I, Darren, have you know, represented or presented two different sides of this colonialism model or metaphor, if that's the right term.
I think you're bringing up sort of the epistemology and this question of who gets to be an expert, whose knowledge is valid. All of that absolutely is important. But I think even on the sort of the let's go to Africa, let's go to darkest Africa and find us some plesiosaurs. Even then, though, even when there is a respect for traditional beliefs or indigenous viewpoints or whatnot, I still think it's in service. It is in service to a goal that is very outside of perhaps what the people who live there
Well,
want or feel.
Sorry, can I respond very,
Yes,
very briefly to
please
Gregory's
do.
point, which there's less, in a way, there's less disagreement than might be implied by your response to what I said, Greg. Because I've always thought from the cryptozoological literature that it's rarely the raw data, whatever we mean by that, you know, the anecdotal and eyewitness evidence. It's rarely that's the problem, whatever its origin, whether it's eyewitness accounts that come from European explorers or whether it's indigenous knowledge. It instead is the interpretation that's placed upon it. And this prehistoric survivor paradigm that I mentioned is a paradigm. It's a specific way of interpreting these accounts. So if people in a part of the world say that they have a belief in or knowledge of a certain creature, we are unsure about what that creature is because we don't have specimens of it. For any one of these creatures, the most famous one, of course, is Makila Mbembe of the Congolese region. There's these stories about there being this large water-dwelling river creature with a rounded back, and it probably eats plants. 20th century Europeans have interpreted that as a living sauropod dinosaur. So that's the specific cryptozoological claim. And I'm countering that. I'm saying that's the colonial thing. That's the thing where you foisted your European or North American, mostly, perspective on those kinds of creatures. It doesn't negate the fact that there is an existing law about the creature, because we don't know. For virtually all of these cases, we know almost nothing about the indigenous backgrounds. When this varies, you know, according to which sort of mystery creature we're talking about. But for the African ones and a lot of the South American ones, we essentially only have this late 1800s, early 1900s explorers' tales, and then the Africans and South Americans who then talk about these stories are saying the stuff they've learned from the Europeans back to the Europeans, who are always looking to see it be reinforced. And we don't have the millennium scale actual, you know, detailed knowledge that might be there. Maybe it's now been lost to time, but I think there's a nuance here, and my skeptical take is more skeptical towards the European interpretation than it is towards the law in the first place.
Enough. But on the other hand, there are cases where we do have a recent or contemporary ethnographic context for certain claims that local people make. Local people, by the way, who had very little, if any at all, knowledge of creatures supposedly, well, not supposedly, or that have been declared extinct, such as sauropods, as you mentioned, or even, you know, mammals that have been deemed extinct far more recently. So the kind of contrast that you imply there, I think that highlights another difference. I've sometimes wondered whether there can be any such thing as an ethno-cryptozoology, if you will. And I think I've more or less decided that's actually not from the local indigenous point of view. When people say, you know, that there are turtles living up in the mountains, whereas, you know, herpetological records suggest that there aren't, or indeed creatures that might be described as ape men, non-sapiens hominins, still existing in small numbers in certain places. That is well, that's an interpretation necessarily by an anthropologist, but the record there, the ethnographic record is recent, and it, you know, reflects fairly straightforwardly what people say they've seen or heard, and this is just stated, you know, like in the same way they say there are 3 or 4 species of palm trees that we cultivate, or whatever. So that there isn't that contrast, that challenge to any kind of established Western knowledge to academic zoology, in a word, that you might find with the sort of thing you're talking about, where people, Westerners specifically, are interpreting creatures we don't know what they are, that the local people say exist or existed within the framework of some sort of fossil record.
I think this also brings up one of the issues that Darren brought up too, which is that we've got, on the one hand, the superstars, the Bigfoots and those animals, and then we've got all of the local, hyper-local, individualistic animals, creatures, spirits, and things that happen in different places. So we've got that, and each of them are going to attract very different levels of outside interest. Obviously, the superstars are going to attract the most. And then also place. So every place is different. So for me, working in the US and in particular in the Pacific Northwest, where Bigfoot is home, I'm very interested. And so what we've got here is, again, we've got American, largely, cryptozoologists who are interested in Bigfoot, who strategically use stories allegedly from local populations, although there's a very thin ethnographic record of that, and no anthropologist. Greg, I think you are relatively rare in that you are an anthropologist who actually has firsthand collected these stories in a contemporary kind of a context. And most of, let's say, the North American ones were taken back in the time of Franz Boas. Like, that stuff is old, and has never been like verified or looked at again. So it creates a creature who is, on the one hand, clearly a product of American popular culture, but on the other hand, has this very weird, uneasy relationship with these various Pacific Northwest tribes. I don't know, Samantha, Richard, other kind of places and ways in which some of this is working or not working?
I guess, if I may, I mean, I don't want to repeat what's already been said, but I think for me, looking back at Hooverman's definition of cryptids as creatures unknown to science, that kind of prioritizes that kind of neo-colonial approach. And I guess one of the things that I found particularly interesting in pulling together and editing the chapters for the Anthropology and Cryptozoology book were the examples where there were cryptids who, within the ethnographic context, were accepted by local people as being both a known kind of zoological species, but also a shape-shifting kind of apparition, and that there's that really porous boundary that I think has really thrown a lot of, or made it really difficult for people who are, I guess, for want of a better turn of phrase, Western, to kind of understand or engage with these entities. So like Michael Hennies in the book talks about the Naga shape-shifting were-tigers, essentially. And the distinction for his local informants was that the were-tigers and the Bengal tigers were interchangeable in certain contexts. And I think that's I think that's something that I found.
Isn't that also similar a little to the Zanzibar leopard?
Yeah,
where it's also sort of positioned and seen as a real animal, and there are real animals, versus it's also has this different component.
Yeah, exactly. So that it's which is familiar, but also a zoological entity, despite being declared extinct on Zanzibar.
Which again is one of the more interesting questions about this whole thing, which again Darren brought up, which is this are they, is the search about finding them as real zoological creatures, or is it about finding a spiritual being who connects with me on a personal level? Because personally, one of the things I'm interested in, and I have been since my early research with tattooing, is narratives. How do people position themselves within a community, and how do they use narrative to do that? And witness encounters, that personal encounter, and I'd love to hear your story, Sam, but are so important, I think, to cryptozoology, because it serves as the basis for so much of the evidence, but for the people to create this identity within this alternative community that is heavily stigmatized by almost everybody else. On a different note, Richard, let's go to your period of time. Could the Loch Ness Monster exist without the 19th century?
Yeah, I don't want to derail the new colonialism by going back to the old colonialism, but I feel like it's I know better. I mean, it certainly couldn't. I suppose one anecdote that comes to mind as being very relevant, particularly to the questions of identity that have been discussed, question of authority, and questions of indigenous knowledge, is one that perhaps everyone is familiar with: the question of Thomas Jefferson and George Cuvier in the 1790s, and the debate about, well, effectively whether paleontology is actually looking at extinct animals. So Cuvier was the first to declare more or less convincingly that animals could go extinct, and very quickly that became a consensus. Jefferson, in the 1790s, believed that the fossils being uncovered in America, particularly fossils of what he called megalonyx, could still be out there. And so this was obviously large kind of Western expansion fueled kind of hunger for a symbolic animal that would represent America's kind of ferocity on the world stage. And Jefferson, of course, representing a different tradition of scientific knowledge to Cuvier, the model of what will become a more professionalized kind of savant in Paris, versus the kind of more polymathic generalist who has this theory which he believes is equal to Cuvier's theory, which is that these fossils are extinct animals. Jefferson's theory is they will be found. It's, of course, the classic negative evidence kind of cryptozoological problem that continues to this day. Is obviously you can't disprove that the megalonyx isn't out there in the American West. But it was very much tied into a US expansion. I mean, Lewis and Clark were supposed to be looking for this animal if it existed. They didn't find it.
Were they?
Yeah, Lewis and Clark. Yeah, no, I believe that's not something that's anecdotal. As far as I understand, that is true. So that's kind of tied into, obviously, paleontology. Cryptozoology is tied into paleontology, because if these animals, if no one thinks they're extinct, then obviously they're out there. But this is the period when extinction suddenly becomes a key consensus in the scientific, kind of European and American scientific community around about 1800. But Jefferson, representing a different tradition, is really moving away from that. And in the same way that, of course, Jefferson's a man of great power, but it is still an aspect of the dynamic between institutional scientists and more anecdotal, shall we say, less institutionally grounded individuals making claims which they believe they have the right to make in the public sphere. Of course, that's an 18th century idea, the public sphere, which has more or less been kind of crushed out by the development of science across the 19th century. But it's interesting that really many of the dynamics we see in the completely different world of the 21st century are there in that individual kind of clash between who has the right to pronounce on what is or isn't out there in nature. Returning very briefly to the Plesiosaurus, the Loch Ness Monster is something that Darren, I'm sure, knows a lot more about than I do. But the Plesiosaurus is one of the most popular 19th century prehistoric animals. It's far more interesting for the most part than dinosaurs to most people. Its name is a household word. It's the kind of thing you make a joke about in a newspaper for general audiences they'll understand. And it's notoriously monstrous because it represents the classic line is it's a snake threaded through a turtle. It really does represent something kind of slightly more uncannily alien. Cuvier himself kind of says it's the most monstrous thing that's ever been discovered. And so, there's a reason the Loch Ness Monster wasn't some obscure kind of, fossil horse or something. It's because it was one of the most representative animals in media, and and its popularization so vast that that's inevitably there. And the sauropods, of course, is a related example. Just before the Loch Ness Monster, the idea a giant sauropod is still alive is, of course, because the 1900s was the time for giant sauropods in popular media and popular kind of journalism in natural history museums. It's just a kind of clear one-to-one basis for that.
Yeah.
About 5 years after the two biggest natural history museums in the world get their Diplodocus skeletons and Brontosaurus skeletons, somehow sauropods are discovered in Rhodesia. Yeah. But it's clearly, what's for spaces that are being filled by colonialism, whether in expansion across the US or expansion into Africa, the scramble for Africa, there's a real clear relationship. They're both Jefferson 1790s and Rhodesia in the 1900s. Sorry, Darren.
No, sorry, I just liked your point about the alleged living sauropods in Rhodesia, because they weren't today we think of this living sauropod trope as being unique to Democratic Republic of Congo and the surrounding countries, but in the late 1800s, early 1900s, it wasn't. It was basically the whole of Africa, north to south, east to west, was game in terms of like where people claimed that they had seen sauropod-like animals from South Africa.
Why do you think it's now limited sort of just to that? Is it because it's the darkest, the least explored, what is the Congo in terms of why that? Yeah.
I think that's it. I think it's because it's become, by the time Hoovermans and Sanderson and others were writing about it between the 50s and the 1980s, really, that was the time when this is the place where if there are giant undiscovered reptiles living in Africa that roughly correspond to the sorts of things known from indigenous lore, then that's where they're going to be. They can't be in Cape Province or in the Atlas Mountains. So that's it. And if you look at
go ahead.
No, sorry, please go on.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say, if you look at the classic, go-to books on Makila Mbembe, like Roy Mackall's A Living Dinosaur, it's not just that they report that cryptozoologists propose there might be a sauropod-like animal. There's a list of about 20 different alleged prehistoric survivors. This menagerie of, it literally is like Arthur Conan Doyle's Lost World. There's meant to be living pterosaurs and then living Paleogene mammals, and more recently that the current lore, the most popular mystery animal that Congolese people say to European explorers is there and yet to be discovered are giant spiders, man-sized spiders, which we just didn't tell you about those animals before because you never asked.
Whoa.
So and there's meant to be giant snakes.
I would have said that one right off the bat. There's a giant spider in my village.
Yes, well, I guess a lot of people go in there and not find a Makila Mbembe. There's also this to discover. There's also this to discover.
Well, and then because these cryptids are by definition hidden in the darkest of the jungles, and same with the Pacific Northwest, it's always the forests are impenetrable, and you know what I mean? Like, we don't have the dark thing, but it's a very different sort of a thing. At any rate, there's murders in there, and it's a whole different world in those forests. And so because the cryptids are so well hidden, then that means that in order to find them, you have to take on this almost, again, 19th century colonial expedition, maybe minus the pith helmet, but you've got to be doing those expeditions out into the wild. And if you're in America, you do it on TV. Of course, we have 10 million TV shows now focused just on the expeditions. To me, there's something also, the sort of the masculine energy in those and in the production of those shows. Like, that's a whole different sort of, I think, thing that's becoming laid on to these creatures. Anyway, that's sort of my take on some of what's going on in the United States.
Could I just jump in again? I mean, one thing I would say is that the majority, perhaps the vast majority of cryptids that have been proposed by American television producers or whomever, maybe Heuvelmans and some of his followers, are probably not at all grounded in actual empirical animals. But that doesn't mean to say, of course, that all of them are complete nonsense, or they're cultural constructs or products of some sort of colonial mentality going in whatever direction. But I kind of, I'm trying to segue from there to another point, which has to do with the empirical, sorry, the definitional issue. Well, what is cryptozoology? How does it relate to anthropology, say, or history, or indeed to zoology? I mean, I think we've already established that cryptozoology, or a lot of what we call cryptozoology, exists only in opposition to, conventional zoology. It's something. It's about animals that are not accepted or haven't yet been accepted as existing as real species by professional, authoritative zoologists. But just to get a bit more substantial, perhaps, I mean, what do we make of animals, species, some of which, so far as I know, have never been recognized as cryptids by Westerners, or at least not for any length of time, but which have nevertheless proven to exist. I'm thinking about things like the South African and Indonesian coelacanths, the Laotian. What's it called? I was going to say rock rabbit, but
rock rat. Yeah, the rock rat.
Rock rat, that's the one. Yeah, and about rabbit sized, I think, or getting on there. I'm just wondering. I mean, is that part of? Should that be part of, or how exactly could that be part of ethnographic or anthropological interest, because these are animals that certainly disprove Cuvier's dictum, which said something like all I don't know, large mammals have
well, remember,
been discovered.
I'm sorry to remember that Hooverman said that Cuvier said that, but Cuvier didn't say that. It's
I've looked him up and he said something very similar. What's your version of it?
Well, he implies that when the Malayan tapir is discovered, that there's probably no new large mammals to discover. But I think that I think that the reason there's often seems to be this conflict between what is a without generalizing your position, you're thinking of the undiscovered flesh and blood animals, which is obviously clearly a big part of cryptozoology, and at the same time there is this sort of folkloric anthropological perspective that these stories don't necessarily have real animals at the bottom of them. And then which animals are within the cryptozoological canon, you alluded to that as well, with the reference to coelacanths and the koala zoo, the rock rat, and so on. And basically there's a big tangled mess there that we haven't resolved. I've been interested in that for the couple of decades I've been interested in cryptozoology. It doesn't seem to be being resolved, and it doesn't seem that it's going to be resolved. What is in cryptozoology and what isn't? Because it's clear there's a whole bunch of mysteries there that are zoological. They do have real animals at the bottom of them. It would be grossly unfair to imply that everything discussed in the cryptozoological literature can be, dismissed as anecdotes, tall tales, legends, or what have you. But at the same time, there clearly is that component there as well. We are clearly, in many cases, Margo was referring to First Nations stories from, a lot of the accounts that are now included in the Sasquatch canon don't describe entities that are at all similar to Bigfoot as is established, as it's meant to look in cryptozoological canon. We clearly are, in some cases, we're picking and choosing the bits we like, and ignoring the bits we don't. And if Hooverman said at some point that a cryptid should be monstrous and surprising, so therefore there's this idea that the creatures in cryptozoological canon are all meant to be like, weird giant animals. But at the same time, he and everyone of the same school as him at the same time did discuss animals like Greg, the rock rat you discussed in Hooverman's famous list of 1986. There's a small marmot type animal, and there's a small flightless bird from the Indian Ocean, and it's like those aren't monstrous or surprising. Those are just almost certainly new species of the kind of which, you know, tens of which are discovered every year. There's clearly a massive number of animals that zoologists have seen and which one day will be discovered.
At the same time, I wasn't referring at all to Hooverman. I was referring to Cuvier, who did refer to large mammals. Now, I did some research into this, partly among zoological colleagues, regarding what was a large mammal, and it turns out that I don't think there's any definition, you know, any precise definition, but it doesn't have to be terribly big. I mean, in fact, a rat would probably be about the limit. So anything of that size or larger would be a large mammal. Now, you know, since Cuvier wrote that, well, gorillas, for example, have been discovered. The genus gorilla wasn't, you know, well, it wasn't a conventional zoological category until after Cuvier wrote that. So you know, he got it wrong on that count. And there have been many other, and the one mentioned most often, perhaps, is the what you call the okapi in Africa, and getting outside of the mammal category, been many more. I think the Komodo dragon, for example, was known to Beminese and Western Florinese peoples and so on, and this has been documented before it was discovered by, well, you could say by pearl fishermen, some of whom at any rate were Europeans. Anyway, that was taken up by a Dutchman whose name I don't recall, not so good at names these days. But anyway, it was documented in 1912, I think, as a Varanus or Varanus species. So you know, there's another one, and there've been a number of them. And I'm talking about, and I'm most interested in creatures that were recognized by local people. I mean, it seems to me that cryptozoologist applies to many different categories, social categories, indeed, of people, and that we do get into a bit of a mess sometimes if we don't distinguish these clearly.
I mean,
enough.
Just briefly,
sorry,
Margo.
Oh, go ahead. I was just going to say, I invited Jeff Meldrum to be on this panel, who is one of the only tenured academics who is a strong cryptozoologist, and he didn't even respond.
I would deny that, actually.
Oh, really?
I rather hesitate. This is one of my motivations. I rather hesitate to be called a cryptozoologist, because I'm not sure that I am. I mean, I'm an ethnozoologist, and part of my ethnozoology takes me to look at creatures that I'm unable to match with the list of documented species that has been compiled so far by academic biologists. I have in fact published on this while I have been a tenured academic. I mean, the last couple of years, I had a book out earlier this year, which was written largely after I retired. So as one critic wrote, you know, I'm safely required on a fat pension. How he knew that, I have no idea. It's very debatable.
I still think
it's safe for me to go rogue. That's the sort of attitude.
But you never went as rogue as Meldrum did. He is a major proponent of Bigfoot, and he is in possession of all of those big feet, and he has staked his reputation on it in I think quite an interesting way. And I would have loved to have him here so we could talk about it. Richard, what were you going to say earlier?
Well, I was going to add just briefly to the Cuvier's dictum, whether or not he said it, I don't know. Cuvier is often getting quoted and paraphrased, but obviously it was integral to his career that cryptids didn't exist, because earlier on is very, very debatable whether or not there's still spaces in which giant animals might exist. But of course, for Cuvier, it's quite important that they are extinct for his purposes of declaring extinction to be a thing. And until, you know, there's relative umming and ahhing about this into the 1830s, kind of international scientific community, among authoritative sources who will claim that there are still, there might be plesiosaurs out there might be kind of large mammals out there. So for him, his claim against what we'd call cryptozoology is integral to his career. And of course, that changes later on, whether or not a big name naturalist might benefit from actually being a bit more kind of positive or a bit more kind of eager. I mean, later 19th century, the period we talked about earlier, when you have kind of relatively big names suggesting that a Mylodon might exist in South America, in Patagonia, that's obviously not damaging to their careers. Whereas now, I suppose there's maybe issues where creationism or kind of issues of kind of clashes suggest actually you don't want to be tarred with that brush.
Right.
But at different times and different places, the PR might be good for you to be able to declare something quite exciting like that.
And when we think about the way that Western science has developed, had it taken a different trajectory, maybe cryptozoology would be in it rather than outside of it. If the amateur naturalists and, the kind of
it's quite integral, isn't it? But cryptozoology, it's coined, the 50s? So,
yes.
Post-war, heavily more professionalized environment for the sciences in the US in particular, compared to what is still quite a fluid way in British science, but also to an extent American science into the early 20th century. Issues of kind of authority, issues of professionalization are not fuzzy. It's not in any way, you don't have to be a university professor to be a respected naturalist necessarily in this period. And so, of course, the claims that come with professional identity are different and less important, whereas now, as I say, we're obviously much more in a professionalized state, and these kind of claims, like you say, you stake your career on them in a way that you didn't necessarily in 1900.
Right. Yeah, I think keying into what I said earlier about we don't really have like there aren't tight boundaries around what cryptozoology is at the moment. Prior to Bernard Hooverman's and Ivan Sanderson, coining this term in the mid-1950s, prior to that term, obviously the idea of are there undiscovered animals outside the main, sort of academic world, that has always been there. That's always been there in parallel to more academic pursuits. But I think part of the reason why some of these ideas about specific cryptids, and by the way, the one of the problems again about talking about cryptozoology is things vary so much according to what cryptid, what mystery creature you have in mind. But one of the reasons why the prehistoric survivor paradigm became so prominent is because of the state of our knowledge at the time. So okay, we've already touched on the colonial thing, but people's knowledge of how long ago the past has obviously changed extraordinarily, more so during the 20th century than any other time. That's probably technically incorrect, but I think you know what I mean. And so when people are discovering fossils in the 1800s and 1900s, they don't clearly know that these animals are from beyond the time that advanced mammals lived, for example. They're still thinking, in Cope and Marsh in the late 1800s are saying that dinosaurs of the Jurassic were probably only living like 4 million years ago. And when people are describing those long-bodied fossil whales from Alabama and from Egypt, they're thinking those animals lived a couple of million years ago. So at least some of the scientists are thinking, could these, let's stick with those giant long-bodied whales, the basilosaurid whales, late Victorian age people are thinking that those animals have only recently been swimming around in the seas. Could they be linked to modern reports of sea monsters? That is then elaborated on in the early 1900s. That becomes canon, if you like, in cryptozoology during the 1950s, partly because people like Hooverman's are extraordinarily, the writers that write about everything with very little specialization. Bernard Hooverman's the main advocate of cryptozoology. He's not an expert on one thing. He writes about everything, and he writes about things that are way outside of his technical wheelhouse. And he's decades out of date when he writes about these things. So his
kind of like us in anthrozoology, by the way. We just write about anything.
So you got to, there's so many strands to this. It's really complicated, and I'm always concerned that in talking about cryptozoology in general, it sounds as if you're dissing on a specific cryptid, whether that be orang pendek or Sasquatch or Makilimumbi. And it's like, no, you need to know the background to that story and need to know the original reports. So I'm probably coming across as quite a skeptic here, but there's a list of cryptids or animals that we regard as part of cryptozoology that think are likely actually real, and for which I think the evidence is quite good. So it's kind, there's nuance to this.
Let's switch over.
Say again?
I said, can you send me a list? Sorry to jump in, like, but of the ones that are possibly real, or probably real, or conceivably hypothetically real.
I'll tell you about my field trips to Sumatra.
I'm being trying to be funny, I suppose. No, please don't.
I'm going to switch gears to the big cats, because they're in some ways one of the more prosaic kinds of cryptids. They also seem to be fairly easily proven in terms of what they seem to be. But because of that, why are they still like, tell me what you think is happening there with the big cats, beyond just the fact that you do in fact have a lot of apparently captive big cats who are roaming around your country. But what else do you think is happening with them? What do they represent?
Sure. Sorry, if I jump in. So yeah, I guess for the specific context, ethnographic context where I was doing field work, they were linked to a kind of powerful, historically grounded narrative of resistance. So there was the part of Wales where I did my fieldwork was very heavily nationalistic, lots of anti-English sentiment. Long history of English colonialism and Welsh oppression, and for them, the fact that the legislation was brought in that made it more difficult for people to keep them as pets in the 1970s.
Was that?
70s. Yeah, and as a result of that, allegedly, and I interviewed lots of people who claimed to have knowledge of these animals being kept as pets by a particular named individual, who then subsequently allegedly released them following this change in legislation. And for my particular kind of human interlocutors, the fact that the cats are still being cited decades later was kind of a really powerful indication of their survival ability. The fact that they were able to either meet up with other former pets who also suffered the same kind of release, and kind of create a viable population was seen as kind of a something to be admired. Obviously, I mean, there are big cat sightings across the UK, and that kind of particular narrative wouldn't necessarily fit in. So I grew up in Southeast London, and there were often sightings of big cats in a woodland close by to us, an urban woodland on Shooters Hill, and the narrative there would probably be very different if you did kind of interviews with people who claim to have seen them. But certainly for the particular ethnographic context that I worked in, that was the rationale. But and I love that.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, you say that they're relatively easy to document, but I think even working with the forensic archaeologists, that there was lots of controversy or debate amongst them as to the techniques that they were using to try and determine whether or not these sheep and on a few occasions equine kills were indeed the fault of felids, or
which is interesting then, because then that, I think another thing that, if I'm going to generalize about cryptozoology, there's that suspicion of science and the authorities. And maybe it's more so in the US, where we already have that sort of base level sort of suspicion of our government. But the idea that they're keeping something from us, or they're doing shady techniques. So you may have sent some hair samples in, but I don't know what they did with those hair samples. They could have switched them out for a tabby cat. And so that always keeps that possibility alive, that's not really what we think it is. I think it's also interesting the way that you point out that the ethnographic data is going to be different in Wales, in London, in the South, whatever, different neighborhoods, maybe even in London, which points to, even with your real animals, the baboon that we know today is a different baboon than 1950s baboon. as a species, they haven't changed in any way, shape, or form, but the techniques to study them, the fact that women are studying them, the fact that all of these different social changes happen in paleontology, or sorry, primatology, has changed the baboon. We have a different baboon today. And I think, and these are real animals. And so if the real animal can be so plastic as to almost change its being based on our interpretation of that being, then what does that say for the animals that we have much less of a grasp on?
I mean, there's certainly the case, isn't it, for kind of living dinosaurs that will obviously reflect ideas of dinosaurs that have changed drastically in 200 years. So, you know, you'll get your older cryptid stories of dinosaurs tail dragging kind of swamp dwellers. That's not in any way what sauropods are us nowadays. And in the illustrations, you know, you'll have postures, or Plesiosaurus indeed, for Loch Ness Monster, which presumably if there was Loch Ness Monster out there, it wouldn't have the kind of swan posture. And so they very much kind of, as you say, the plasticity there is incredible. As you say, plasticity for a baboon is big. Plasticity for an animal that's never been seen is massive.
I like the concept of a museum of ideas. I forget where I encountered it, but certain philosophical areas, you get this this set of outdated notions that persist in a community, and cryptozoology is full of them. It's like all of these prehistoric survivors I keep mentioning. They're cultural anachronisms rather than zoological ones. On the other hand, I think for certain cryptids, it's like you have two interesting things happening in parallel, which is on the one hand, so Margo, what you just said about baboons, some people, John Bindernagel in particular, have argued that what might endorse Bigfoot Sasquatch as a real animal is the fact that the stories, which, as you know, originate late 1950s California before it gets linked to Sasquatch in Canada, they don't go through the killer ape phase that the known great apes in Africa and the orangutan as well did, actually. This thinking that they were horrible sort of, you know, animals that carried women off into the forest. Bigfoot didn't really have that.
Right.
So does that support the idea that it's a real animal? But then in parallel to that, we have this creature building concept in cryptozoology where people modify their view of an animal, find that it doesn't match things that are known from the fossil record, and come up with an increasingly sort of elaborate and almost Baroque view of what it might be like as a living thing. And Sasquatch today, if you were to go and, you know, do a straw poll among Sasquatch researchers, Bigfoot researchers, it's now meant to be like a super terrifying apex predator that can use infrasound and disguise itself somehow by interfering with our senses, and it can
from throwing rocks to scare you to using sonar. That's an update.
Yes, and then some people, you could do an entire hours and hours and hours long discussion just on Bigfoot alone, but views are so disparate. You have a sector of the Bigfoot believing community that do think that Bigfoot is probably responsible for numerous human disappearances, and there are many cases where, you know, missing people are missing because of predation from Bigfoot.
Right.
Well, what about what John Bindernagel said about Bigfoot not being a killer ape? It's like we've got both of these things happening again. It's this massive sort of,
well, I mean, because the theories have to change as the times change. So we're talking about Northern California when the Emerald Triangle begins, and so we're starting to get massive pot production up there, and associated with that is a lot of violence. Way less so today now that it's legal, but even so, there's still a lot of competing groups up there operating, and there have been killings as well as disappearances. So you got to account for those somehow.
Can I just jump in here? I'm John Bindernagel, who I sort of know of. I know his book, the main one, was a professional, he's dead now, but he was a professional field biologist. Whereas the sort of shape-shifting, sonar using whatever, I mean, who is proposing that representation of Bigfoot? I mean, I would suggest it's people for the most part without academic qualifications. So again, you know, there are very many different sorts of people who have been put under this rubric of cryptozoology or cryptozoologist. The fact that you have different perceptions of things by, well, academics on the one hand, ignoring for the moment different sorts of academics, and on the other, members of the general public who happen to be fascinated for some reason or other in the possibility of the existence of something. I mean, this is typical, surely, of all sorts of areas of knowledge. I mean, I don't think it discredits any in particular, does it?
Well, I think it's interesting, and I know it was brought up in the email ahead of time, the young creationism and the fact that creationists, or at least a subset of that population, has hitched its wagon to the cryptozoological wagon, because if any of the evolutionary relic animals are found, then boom, that's it for evolution. That's it for, everything that we know about natural science, right? And that's interesting. That, I mean, talk about, I guess, strange bedfellows.
Sorry, Richard. No, go on, please.
All I was going to say is that I get it's obviously always been there in young Earth creationism, the idea that these animals might still survive. But it's very interesting to me that it's not made much of until the late 20th century, when prehistoric animals are in much more popular media. It's a kind of Jurassic Park kind of post-1980s kind of development, to my understanding. I'm not an expert on kind of post-war creationism, but it's the areas that I am interested in the early 20th century, leading creationists like George Macready Price, basically the only young Earth creationist at the time, Canadian American. He says, yeah, Mosasaurus might still be around, but he's not at all interested. His credibility is not hinging on that claim. He is not willing to make those kind of sensational claims. The changes in culture that have happened across the 20th century mean that then and now, that's much more something that a creationist, a young Earth creationist, wants to popularize their kind of their discipline based on. It's much more important to appeal to that kind of more popular media aspect of paleontology, whereas in the early 20th century, the key was to have as boring and super scientific creationism as possible. You didn't want to have sensational claims that don't exist, whereas now that is obviously much more seen as much more of a viable strategy for their work.
Well, and in the U.S. in particular, I mean, again, that's sort of where most of my knowledge is. We have an evangelical, movement that is absolutely hitched onto that. In Montana, which is where I live, rural state, we have a creation museum, but it's not called a creation museum. It's called a dinosaur museum, because it's got dinosaur skeletons in it, and it looks like a dinosaur museum, but it's a creation museum. Our governor raised funds for it to get it built, and it literally, that's what you would think. Oh, and they have schools that take their field trips, public schools, to that museum. So there's just a lot of room these days for those lines that we once thought were pretty solid between, let's say, popular culture and, science. Everything is being blurred.
I mean, journalism's been key to cryptozoology from the start, right? If you think sea serpents, the early 19th century in America, those are due to increasingly popular forms of journalism.
Yes.
And the tabloid media, which develops in the late 19th century and then becomes, a monolith, is the leading purveyor of, of cryptozoological kind of literature for the most part, certainly in terms of mass numbers. It's a science or a pseudoscience which is massively mediated by the popular media, and that's of course because those represent a democratic alternative to the scientific establishment as it increasingly develops. Is with a double helix along with scientific professionalization and the spread of tabloid journalism.
And again, the entertainment and the science all mixed up, like from the dime museums from a couple centuries ago, all the way up to today. There's just the education, the science, plus the popular science, plus the more speculative science. It all kind of gets all mixed up together. And then in the US, we have the extra additional context of the, excuse my language, but the batshit insane kind of group of folks which believe that, let's say, that the Windsors, for instance, are lizard people. There are so many people that can can.
Good question. Now the Queen is dead. What does that mean for the theory that the Windsors are lizards? Is it going to be an autopsy?
I think it's just her shell, the human shell,
Yeah.
the fake shell. That's what's dead. But
Do you
she's
know
still
she's dead for sure, Richard? You don't know, do you? You don't know for
True.
sure.
None of us
It's not
know.
true, but she's not dead. Or the other way
Yeah,
around.
I mean, I
Can
haven't
I-
seen it. I don't know that she's dead.
Can I draw a line really briefly just under the creationism thing, just because I just want to say creationists love cryptozoology. They use it all the time. They always say, oh, this carcass could have been a modern plesiosaur, and these dinosaurs, this could be surviving sauropod dinosaurs. So that's there used by creationism. But in terms of the actual role that creationists themselves have in modern cryptozoology, there's a couple of them that do write books on it and occasionally go to places like the Congo, but it's not taken seriously even by the majority of self-identifying cryptozoologists. So I don't want people thinking that a big swathe of people who call themselves cryptozoologists are also creationists. They're very much in the minority.
I'm glad you clarified that towards the end. But we come a long way from big cats in Wales or wherever, and I'm kind of interested in that. As it happens, I've been on a 5-day expedition of Northumberland. Walking along Hadrian's Wall yesterday, I actually walked 5 miles, so I'm quite proud of myself. But our guide, who's a real Geordie, and he knew the local territory like the back of his hand. But towards the end, without knowing, who I was professionally or in my former life before retirement, told me that he'd seen this big cat. And I said, oh, really interesting. He said, yeah. He said last summer he was out somewhere far from settlements, somewhere near a place called Allendale in County Durham, I think it was. Anyway, he brings out his cell phone, and he's got a film, which he promised to send me. I haven't received it yet, but he showed it to me at the time, and indeed, you hear him sort of calling to this thing because he thinks it's a dog or something. And then it gets a bit closer and he backs off because it doesn't look very much like a dog. I mean, what it was, I can't say, but an interesting kind of coincidence. I mean, I know that if we get back to Samantha's book, the one she edited, there's a guy called Franklin, I think it is, who made a strong case for which not everybody agrees with, of course, but quite a strong case for these things representing survivals of escapees or pets that were released and somehow have managed to propagate their kind up until last year. At any rate, one thought that came to mind in all this was, and I realize this is an anecdote, so I might want to call it some kind of evidence. But what one point that came to mind is that a lot of these things seem to be, and I may be wrong factually, but a lot of these things seem to be represented as Black Panthers, melanistic leopards, I suppose, for the most part. Is there any particular significance in this, or can you comment again, Samantha, on any of this stuff?
Yeah, sure. I think certainly from the people I spoke with during my fieldwork that they had been popular pets. That that particular the melanistic color, the black coloration was just a aesthetically desirable in the pet trade, and so as a result, I mean, I don't know, I'm not a geneticist, I don't know whether 2 melanistic leopards are more likely to produce melanistic offspring, but certainly the leopards that they were describing, or the big cats they were describing having seen kept as pets, were melanistic leopards, and so maybe that then translated into if people thought they saw something unusual in the distance, then maybe they kind of coloured it to conform to that that historical.
This one certainly looked black on the film I was shown, but I don't know if you remember the essay that I published in your volume about feral cats and all sorts of things. There's some claim, some evidence from mammalogists that I think it's black toms, particularly, or ginger ones, tend to, after you've had them out there for a while and breeding in the wild and so on, that they do tend to predominate for reasons that are a little bit complex. I won't try to recall what I said right now, but I'm just wondering if there were some leopards or pumas, cougars or whatever reproducing in the wilds of Northumbria.
The bulk
whether melanism would somehow become more common for genetic and of course ecological reasons as well, in terms of claiming mates and competing with other males and all this sort of thing, presuming there are any out there.
Yeah, they do breed true if they are black, and the vast bulk of British big cats are black. It's about 75 to 80% of all sightings are black, but there's brown ones. Yeah, there's brown ones as well, tawny coloured ones that sound more like regular pumas, and then there's also lynx type cats as well. So part of the British big cat phenomenon is that we don't have seemingly a single same kind of animal. People do seem to be reporting different things.
Well, wouldn't that, sorry, go ahead.
No, it was
this thing had a long black tail, by the way. It definitely wasn't a lynx, which had very short tail.
Okay, I was just going to say, because I feel like we're running out of time, just in terms of, let's say, the life history, like to use an old anthropological concept, if we did a life history of each cryptid, in the US, what we're finding is that the ones that may have had a little bit of a life back in the 50s or the 60s, whether or not they still exist today as a being and whether there are still encounters and witness sightings and whatnot, seems to hinge on how much commercialization is associated with that individual animal. Because, of course, they're mostly rural. There's very, very few urban cryptids. So they're mostly rural. And in the US, that means we're looking at kind of a dying part of our country a little bit. And so those small towns that were lucky enough, let's say West Virginia, the cryptid, the Flatwoods monster, literally, it's a one-day sighting of a bunch of people. But because that small town, and usually it's some kind of a newspaper person within the town, comes up with the idea of let's have a festival. And they've been having this festival for years, and it keeps the town alive and it keeps the monster alive. What about the life cycles of other cryptids that maybe don't have that kind of commercial support?
It's a big and complex subject. And I certainly think there's things that wax and wane for whatever reason. And if they are creatures that have seemingly disappeared from the radar, it's not impossible that they really have declined or gone extinct. So an example would be the medieval reports of the Tatzelwurm from the Alps. So this long-bodied bipedal lizard, which it's not impossible that people were actually seeing an unusual lizard of some kind. But then there's other things that, they just become popular for a time. The modern ecosystem means that they thrive in podcasts and YouTube and reality TV. So as I've said in the emails that we've sent around, Dogman is currently like North America's favorite cryptid alongside Bigfoot. Mothman is obviously hugely popular, done the same thing as what you were just describing, Margo. And there's...
Well, and then it's interesting which ones take on additional lives. So for instance, Mothman is an absolute icon in the LGBTQ community. Sort of the same way that mermaids are. And that's interesting. That's interesting when they, again, take on a different life when they become embraced by a different community. The Mothman, nobody sees the Mothman as scary anymore, even though apparently those sightings were very scary. I think that's another thing too, for the people that are going out and looking. And I would, of course, love to have my own encounter. But I don't know. I wonder how much an openness of the mind or faith perhaps allows it. Samantha, you had your own encounter.
I did, yeah, and it was kind of unexpected and it was frightening. And I was based in a very rural part of Wales for doing fieldwork, and I had several horses and sheep in my care, and I was out one night on the Cambrian Mountains checking the horses with a large dog, who suddenly inexplicably became terrified. His hackles went up, he was shaking, he'd been up ahead sniffing around and just bolted back to my leg and was whimpering. And I saw a kind of a shadowy shape, and the horses all kind of put their tails up and bolted, and and then starting to dig around the next day, found that there had been several sightings on a local farm, and some lamb losses as well that had ended up being forensically analysed. So yeah, that kind of corroborated my sighting for me. But even had I not had that kind of official corroboration, it was a very tangible, a very visceral, terrifying experience that really kind of, I guess, consolidated my interest in it. But yeah.
It's interesting how your story included the elements that are found in other stories. The dog, the horses, you know what I mean? It's like that's corroborating evidence, which is always good.
Yeah, I guess one of the examples that I used in my chapter in the edited volume was around how there'd been quite a lot of, so the Welsh Assembly government had been quite negative or quite dismissive of sightings, and as had the local press, until an off-duty police officer saw a sighting in the neighbouring county of Pembrokeshire, and all of a sudden the press kind of turned 80 degrees in their reporting of big cat sightings. That all of a sudden they had a credible eyewitness and an authority figure, whereas I guess even me as a crackpot academic was not seen as a legitimate eyewitness. And funnily enough, I did an interview on Radio 4 when I first published on the big cat sighting, and on the Thinking Aloud programme with Laurie Taylor, which is kind of an established long-running series. And he finished my interview by saying, well, if anyone else hears or sees things that go bump in the night, then perhaps they'd like to. So kind of being really kind of poo-pooing my experience, which was a bit demoralising. But yeah, I think.
I'm so sorry, Sam. Sorry.
No, go ahead.
I've probably seen a British big cat, but it's an incredibly mundane sighting, and nothing really special. I can't think what else it was. It was a hay on Wye and the Welsh borders, and I like Hay Bluff, which is like a sort of big bluff, and would wander out from where we were staying and just go and look at the countryside in the darkness, because I'm a bit strange like that, and in peripheral vision, at a location that I was able to check the next day, I saw a large, classically people describe these animals as Labrador size. It was exactly the right size for like a fairly slim, smallish leopard, and it was black. And I've actually always been terrified of encountering big cats in the wild. I've got an unusual level of fear for a bunch of reasons. But I checked out the next day, and it's like, well, there was a big animal there. There are no dogs here. It was in the middle of an enclosed area. There are no dogs there at all, and there's no other animal that could conform with it. So boring, but
yeah. And I guess something that I've never included in any of my publications, but one of the interviews that I did was with someone who had a job for a while at a local animalarium, who had a leopard called Raja, and apparently they'd on occasion seen evidence of kind of paw marks outside of his enclosure, and they liked to speculate, or they wanted to speculate, that perhaps a feral female leopard had come and kind of mated with Raja through the enclosure mesh.
It's a frustration to me how there's a lot of really good data for the reality of non-native big cats living wild in the British countryside, and the evidence still isn't out there. A lot of it is being sat on by amateur researchers who aren't qualified scientists. So there's hairs that have been analysed genetically and microscopically and which have been verified as those of puma, lynx and leopard. There's tracks that are absolutely legit. There's droppings, and there's all this bite mark evidence that Sam, you already referred to. And there's at least some fairly okay-ish photographic evidence, but there's not much. There are some fairly good things. But overall, it's a strong case that they are a real thing.
I guess.
Honestly, then that makes them even more interesting, because as the real thing, what they would be is escaped big cats. And to me, that goes back to the core, is cryptids are not just hidden animals, they're also animals that shouldn't be where they are. They're it's back to the Mary Douglas matter out of place thing. They're strays. They have strayed from their time, their place, their species, their category into something new and unusual and upsetting and off-putting. And so even if the explanation is literally that prosaic, just a whole bunch of escaped cats, I still think it fits. I still think it fits with this idea of these unruly, troublesome creatures that are someplace doing something that they should not be doing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, especially when, as I mentioned earlier, the kind of narratives that certainly the people I interviewed gave for why they were almost spiritually significant, and why a sighting was something that they weren't ashamed of, because it had this kind of wider symbolism for them. Yeah, and I guess I was reminded as I was thinking back in preparation for this session about I think George Monbiot, the British environmental journalist. He's written a bit about big cats, and I didn't necessarily agree with everything that he had to say, but he suggests that the fact that there are so many sightings of them suggests that they kind of fill a gap in the postmodern psyche, that people want adventure, or they want to engage with the unknown or the liminal, and big cats are just one way in which they can fulfill that. But
Definitely.
Can I just jump in and state the obvious, and that is that an animal can be, perfectly real, empirically existent, and yet be, fully spiritual, supernatural in certain respects, and of course, symbolic. As somebody pointed out earlier, the problem is to distinguish the ones that are fully symbolic or supernatural, if you will, from the ones where supernaturalism is only an aspect of the creature. So
have you read
yeah.
I'm sorry, the Great Grey Soul of Siberia, this famously good book on Siberian tigers, and I've forgotten the name of the author. I think they're Korean, but they say that in the lore of the local people, the Siberian tiger uses mind speak. It's a shapeshifter. It basically has all these mythical attributes that if we hear them for another animal, we say, well, it's not a real animal. But it's like every single spectacular real world animal that people have been impressed by, they have imbued it with the supernatural at some level.
That's a good example, I should think, yeah.
Well, and then I would argue that it's the same case with real animals. How do we separate out the animal as such from the constructed animal? Do you know what I mean? My dogs, there's a biological dog in there, but anyway, yeah, looks like we're out of time.
Yeah, we're nearing the time that the last panel should start, so we can start that 5 minutes later, but we should possibly wrap this up. And then, if you want to stay a little over in here to talk among yourselves, you can, but we should just wrap this up as a roundtable, at least. Thank you.
Yeah. Does anybody sort of have any kind of something you want to say to sort of close this off, draw a line under it, as it were?
Well, my grandchildren are waiting to be fed, so I should leave. No, it's true. I'm staying with my son in Walthamstow, and my time is just about up. But I very much enjoyed being part of this. even though it does come right in the middle of my holiday, and my wife's not terribly pleased about that. But no, it's been a good conversation. I had kind of hoped to somewhat shamelessly get in a word for my book, which talks about the case I think Margo mentioned, where there is a good ethnographic context for a mystery hominoid, no less. And that's called Between Ape and Human, and it's available in most places in the UK and Canada and the US, and I hope also in university libraries. So if anybody really wants to tear me to pieces, I suggest they read that and then write a thorough critique and show me exactly where I went wrong. So anyway, maybe I can leave it at that, and
Sure.
Yeah, people can continue if they wish to. Yeah, pleased to see Samantha in person for the first time, and remind her how much I admire her work and her energy. Indeed, tremendous. Everybody else seems to be thoroughly well informed within and without their particular areas of specialization. But now I'm retired. I don't really have to, convince anybody of anything, which is perhaps just as well. Anyway, can I say goodbye and get back to my holiday?
Absolutely.
And, feeding my grandchildren.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Yeah.
Bye.
And I'm going to go ahead and let us all go too. You were all very generous with your time. Thank you so much for coming. This has been such a fun discussion. Yeah,
thanks for a fantastic discussion. Thanks for sharing your stories, Darren and Samantha. It's amazing. And I feel like I can't compete with that.
I know. I need to see a big animal now.
Yeah. Well,
all right.
Thank you. Really great discussion. I have